Alright, welcome to our lecture on obstacles to development. And so what we're going to do is we're going to start out, we're going to talk about methods of development and some theories of development. And then we're going to talk about some of the obstacles to development. That's really going to be kind of the crux of our lecture. And then we're going to end by talking about one of the ways to try and overcome some of those obstacles to development. The slides were designed to accompany the cultural landscape. I made some minor tweaks in terms of headings and things like that. And I am, of course, Ms. Gall, and I'll be your host for the day. So, first thing we want to talk about is methods of development. One of the major methods of development, especially historically, has been development through self-sufficiency. And self-sufficiency is really a fancy way of saying relying on yourself. Okay? And so, a few of the characteristics of this approach. One, the pace of development is modest. Okay, so it just means it's not too fast and it's not too slow. It's kind of slowly building. Okay. The distribution of development is generally pretty even within a country, which kind of makes sense because the focus is on developing the whole country and not just on developing one or two areas. Okay. In general, the way that this works is that there are some barriers that are established to help protect local businesses and kind of nurse them through that initial startup phase. And three of the most common barriers that people put in place to try and protect local businesses, or I should say that national governments put in place, are tariffs, import taxes, okay, quotas, which means they only allow a certain number of an item to come through, and last but not least, restricting the number of companies or the number of countries that are allowed to be importers. And typically these are used all together in some combination to try and make local businesses more competitive with international businesses that have a little more experience at this. So there's a handful of major problems with this approach. One is that it does tend to protect inefficient businesses, so it doesn't expose them to the full force of competition. And as a result, what you get sometimes are some businesses that are not as good at what they do as they could be. Also, governments will develop a large bureaucracy, both in terms of trying to encourage local small businesses, but also in trying to cover and protect those barriers and those businesses, using those barriers and things like that, so trying to enforce those barriers. Okay, so another method of development is to look at development through international trade. Okay, and international trade, this is Rostow's model of development, by the way. Basically, what you do is you develop by exposing your businesses, by exposing your people to both the good and the bad of international trade. So the good is that products tend to be cheaper. The bad is that it can be very hard for small businesses to get a foothold in the economy. Okay. And so some examples where this has worked really well, we look at the 4 Asian dragons. And these are, let me see if I can remember them all, Japan, Korea, China's not one of them, Singapore I think is one, and I'm drawing a total blank on the 4th one, but you could look that up and I'm sure you'd be able to find it. You'd also look at the Arabian Peninsula states. And the Arabian Peninsula, that's that great big Santa Claus boot, is the way I heard it described, where Saudi Arabia is, along with Oman, Yemen, and then the United Arab Emirates are also around there. And so they have grown very rich and developed very rapidly by trading what they have available, which is to say petroleum. Okay? And there are some major problems with this approach, though, to development. One is that resource distribution is uneven, and as a result, so is development. Okay? And development here on a global scale, as well as to some degree a local scale. And when we talk about uneven development, it's also in terms of what types of development occurs. It can be very uneven. Okay, there's an increased dependence on more developed countries, which form the markets for these states as they're developing. And what can happen, and really this is a huge downside to this, is that if there's a recession in the developed world in those MDCs, it can be disastrous for exporters, right? Just absolutely disastrous. I mean, they can see their government budgets cut by 25 to 50% over the course of a year or two. So it can really cause some major problems if they're not careful about how they invest the money and making sure that they're making a very conscious effort to invest it evenly and to save money. So the international trade approach is faster and more efficient than that self-sufficiency approach. And a lot of countries have come to this slowly but surely over the course of the 20th century. So by the end of the 20th century, the international trade approach is and remains the most commonly selected path. So a lot of countries tried the self-sufficiency approach and then converted to the international trade approach just because it was a more effective and more efficient path towards development. A great example of this is India. For a lot of years, India had a lot of barriers. They still actually have a lot of internal rules regarding land use and land ownership and trying to build up local corporations, and slowly but surely they've been increasingly internationalizing their trade, and as a result their incomes have come up pretty dramatically over the course of the 20th century, and not everywhere in India, again, is seeing this impact, but a lot more places are than were before. And some of the ways that this has happened is we see the development, for instance, of the World Trade Organization, and the whole point of the WTO, as it's called, is to regulate and manage trade between countries and try and set a basic set of ground rules to make everything fair and equitable so that countries can't just go out and cheat each other. Okay. What this also, international trade also leads to a lot more foreign direct investment, which helps speed up and pick up the pace of development within a country. So just to give you some examples, we could look at some graphs here, and we've got trade as a percent of GDP across time. Our more developed countries, look at the graph on the left here, are in red. Our less developed countries are in blue, and then kind of the world average is in purple. And as you can see, right, starting about 1960, it's gone up a little bit for our more developed countries, but it's actually gone up fairly dramatically, especially from the late 1990s forward in our less developed countries. With the result being that we've seen a lot of growth in those countries and a lot more development. And then if we look at India, looking at per capita GDP and the percent change from the previous year, so now we're looking at change across time, right? During that period of self-sufficiency, the 60s, the 70s, really into the 80s, the early 90s, it's very uneven. It's slowly trending upwards. Slowly. Overall, if we were to draw like a best fit line on that graph, it'd be trending upwards. But when we get to the 1990s and we get to the international trade years, right, you actually start to see a much sharper slope on that best fit line. Because what ends up happening is there's a lot more direct investment, and there's a lot more investment in things like education and the like that encourage that development. Okay. Then if we look at foreign direct investment overall as just in terms of what's flowing in and what's flowing out, right? So the arrows, by the way, red from Europe, purple from the United States. Okay, so where are we investing? And the United States, by and large, is investing in Asia, and this graph was for a book put together in 2011, so the information is probably from about 2009. So investing a lot in Asia, you see a lot in South Korea, pretty fair amount in China, all right? And then we look at what countries are getting invested in. What we see is Brazil, we see Mexico, right? We see some parts of Africa. Egypt gets a lot of inflow, right? China, India. You can see, I mean, a lot of the places where you kind of expect it, right? So where you kind of expect that those countries are getting a lot coming in, just because those are also some of the same countries that are developing some of the quickest. Okay. So some of the obstacles to development, especially using the international trade approach, money is probably the biggest problem, and financing is a big problem. Okay. And so what LDCs end up doing is they tend to take out loans, and they get loans from places like the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund, so and call the International Monetary Fund the IMF. They also get some loans and things from structural adjustment programs from more developed countries, right, where they're basically paying governments to try and adjust and change the way that they're doing business. But then you also get money coming in from foreign direct investment and from transnational corporations. And that's a fancy way of saying companies are building roads, or they're building power plants or other infrastructure to help support their investment. They might be investing in schools and the like. Okay, so it might be that these companies are handing money over, but a lot of times they're just doing these projects to really try and improve the country in order to make a better return on their investment. So one of those things that's always useful to look at, if you look at debt as a percentage of income, in our more developed countries, less than 25%. I mean, it is. Okay, there's a handful of countries where there's no data, but unsurprisingly, some of our less developed countries are the ones where you see 100% or more of their income is debt. And what that means is they've got incredibly high debt payments that they've got to try and make, and if we're paying money to pay down a loan, we're not investing money in roads and infrastructure and the like, right? And so what you can see is some of those newly industrializing countries, they have some of the least amount, right? And again, information probably from roughly about 2009 or so. Okay, so our last little bit here, we're going to talk about fair trade as a way to overcome some of those development obstacles. Okay, and fair trade is really, it's a group of policies, and it's not really policies because it's not governments that tend to implement them so much as it is non-governmental organizations. Okay, and the whole goal is to create products in such a way, and to trade products in such a way that it protects workers, and it protects small businesses in less developed countries. Okay, and so it's this set of standards, and there's different NGOs that will certify products as being fair trade. Okay, so there's fair trade producer standards, and what that means is if their factories or their farms and things like that are meeting certain standards or certain expectations in terms of the way that the machinery works and the way they treat their workers and things like that. There's also fair trade worker standards. So this is how they treat workers. Are they providing insurance? Are they providing opportunities to advance? Are labor unions allowed? Things like that, right? Producer standards might be things like, are they using pesticides? Are they growing in a way that's sustainable? Okay, things of that nature. In general, under a fair trade approach, producers and workers typically earn more. That's to be expected, right? Because the producers and workers earn more, it means that consumers pay more. But a lot of consumers, especially in the more developed world, are willing to pay more because they understand that the producers and the workers producing the product are earning more, and the result is a better standard of living for all. Okay, so this has been our lecture about obstacles to development, and so we talked about a couple of methods of development. Right, talked about self-sufficiency, and we talked about international trade. We talked about some of the obstacles to development, and in particular we focused on financial obstacles to development, okay, which makes sense since really what we're talking about is trade. And then last but not least, we ended our lecture and we talked about fair trade as an approach to development and as a way to help overcome some of those obstacles to development, right? And by the way, producers who make more money and workers who make more money, they spend more money, they pay more in taxes, and so it ends up being kind of a virtuous cycle for governments. So if you have any questions, please feel free to come see me during class, and I guess I will see you the next time class meets.